American Health Care Act. But when I and general members of my community called a few days prior, your staffers did not know how you would vote. Does that mean that a yes vote was a possibility? If not, why not put out public statements ahead of time to show that you hear your constituents?
First off, let me just say that I couldn't say absolutely how I was going to vote because I didn't know what was in the bill. In fact, we didn't know what was in that bill until the night before when it went to the Rules Committee. So it was very difficult to say that it was a good bill or what was in it without seeing it. But when it went to the Rules Committee and it was put on the calendar under a rule that would not allow any amendments, we then knew for sure what was in it. So we knew that it was all bad and that we didn't vote for it. But that's what happens when the majority sets the agenda in the Congress, and the same thing is true in the General Assembly up in Atlanta. The committee chairman of the Rules Committee and the Rules Committee, they set the agenda. Much more so in Washington than in the General Assembly. The Rules Committee sets the terms of debate, how long the bill can be debated, which amendments can be offered to the bill. And if they pass a rule that says that you cannot offer an amendment that would improve the bill, then that amendment would be ruled out of order and it can't even be voted on. And if they have what is known as a closed rule, which they had on this bill, it means that no amendments will be allowed. And so they wrote that bill in the dark of night and they brought it to the Rules Committee and said this is what will be voted on. And it was very easy to vote no. But it was not something I could say ahead of time that I would vote against because, you know, who knows? They might have had lightning strike and done something reasonable. But we try to be cautious and not make a commitment to do something that we don't feel that we have sufficient information to make a decision on.
Okay. The next question is a two-part question. If by executive order or congressional act, churches are allowed to engage in political speech and or activities, will you support legislation to delete their tax-exempt status? And second part, will you support legislation to require all presidents to release their tax returns?
First off, I'm already a co-sponsor of the legislation to require presidents to release the tax returns. As far as the church exemption is concerned, the Constitution is clear on that. The executive order is probably subject to challenge by the in court under the First Amendment Establishment Clause. I would expect that the executive order that the President issued will probably be subjected to some legal challenge in the not-too-distant future. Right now, it's already against the law for churches to engage in campaign activities, and I guess that's what the executive order the President issued is basically saying, is that the agency is not going to enforce that. The Internal Revenue Service is not, he's suggesting and directing them not to enforce that law. Of course, he did swear to uphold the Constitution and the laws of the United States. So, it's already the law. It's against the law. And of course, it's just a matter now of having that law enforced, and the President is saying that he's going to direct the Internal Revenue Service not to enforce it. So that will have to be decided in court.
Next question. What is your position on the voucher DeVos/charter school system changes proposed by the DeVos/Trump Department of Education Administration?
I'm a strong supporter of public education. The District of Columbia has vouchers, and I really have to bite my tongue and bite my lip when that comes up for a vote. The residents of the District of Columbia adopted that, and I believe in home rule, and that was their decision, and so I won't try to overrule and tell them what they should do. But generally, I am not a supporter of vouchers. I believe that public funds should go to support public schools, and that any gaining resources from our children. I believe very strongly that it should not matter what zip code a youngster grows up in, whether he's in rural Georgia or in Atlanta, in urban Georgia, whether he's in one of the poorest communities or one of the wealthiest communities. It should not matter. That child should have the same opportunity to realize his or her potential as any child any place else in this country. And I support that fully.
Next question is breaking news. President Trump just fired the FBI director. What is
Yes.
I think it's despicable. We have a constitutional system. It's unfortunate when we have a leader that does not respect the rule of law and wants to change the rules when the rules don't bend in his favor. I think it's most unfortunate, and I think that it's a sad day in our republic for that attitude and for that to happen and to come from the leader of the greatest country on the face of the earth is really disheartening.
Next question. Can Medicare D please renegotiate with pharmaceutical companies for competition? VA does it already.
That's absolutely true. And in the Affordable Care Act, when we were negotiating that and trying to pass the original act, many of us were trying very desperately to give the authority to the agencies, to HHS, to be able to negotiate with the pharmaceutical companies. The pharmaceutical companies were vehemently opposed to that, and they indicated that they would not support the bill if that were allowed to happen. That is one of the improvements that needs to be made to the Affordable Care Act. We had the problem with the donut hole, and we were able to correct that in the Affordable Care Act. So we save our seniors thousands of dollars every year on their prescription drugs, where they had that $25,000 to $5,000 that they had to pick up out of their pockets before Medicare would kick in again. Well, that was solved in the ACA, which, by the way, will be repealed if the Republican, or if the majority's law goes into effect, which I'm confident that it will not pass as it passed the House. But that is one of the fixes that needs to happen to the ACA.
Okay. Next question. Why does legislation supposedly to help the poor working people and the middle class too frequently consist of tax credits? That's a rich man's tool. People who don't have the money now can't afford to wait for a credit next year.
Absolutely correct. But that, my good friends, is a matter of arithmetic. In the House of Representatives, you got to have 217 votes to pass anything. In the Senate, you've got to have 51 for a simple majority and 60 to defeat a filibuster. So the majority really rules. And when you got a majority of people in the House that feel that tax credits, the rich man's tool, is the way to handle it, they have those votes. That is what's going to happen. If, on the other hand, we had a majority of people who felt like they needed that direct assistance as opposed to getting it at the end of the year, for people who don't itemize, people who don't have the sophistication of filing for a tax credit, then we'll have a different outcome, which again brings us to what I think is most important in our civic life, and that is engagement. Politics is nothing more than who gets what, when, and how. And it's voters that decide who makes those decisions. If there is a majority of people who choose tax credits over the better alternatives, that's what we'll have. That's the unfortunate fact of it. It's a fact of arithmetic in the House of Representatives and those votes. So there are many wonderful things that could be done if we had the people of this country to stand up and say, this is what we will demand. If that happens, and they do that through their votes and their voices, it'll happen. And I'm an optimist. I believe it's going to happen because I believe that people are becoming more engaged and they are not going to sit back any longer.
Next question is, what is VA doing reference to removing Social Security numbers from VA correspondence?
It's my understanding that it had already been removed, that they don't use Social Security numbers, do they?
Who wrote that question, if you don't mind?
Right, so that's them using Social Security numbers as file numbers. There's a file number when you say Social Security. On our last town hall meeting with the former VA Secretary McDonald, he assured us that he would change that, but it's still happening. I wonder if there's any effort that's going to be made.
I had the opportunity to meet with Dr. Shulkin last week, and had I known that, I would have certainly raised that question with him then. But I'll see him again, and it won't be long, and I will, when I get back, raise that issue, because I didn't think that it was still attached to correspondence. Thank you for bringing that to attention. And
yes, ma'am, you had a follow-up on that?
Please remind me to do that when we get back.
They're still using Social Security numbers on retired military for insurance purposes.
I just got my appeal back. 8-9-year appeal. Shut us back. I'm pretty sure my full social was right on that. That's okay.
It was on there?
I'm pretty sure. Okay. Like, I don't have it in front of me, but in my mind's right.
Well, that's an issue that I will certainly dig back and look into.
Okay, next question. Are there any serious efforts to stem young adult violence and neighborhood deterioration other than police increases?
Well, let me say that the method of crime control that is being proposed by the president is just that. there are those of us who've been in Congress who have experienced efforts that have been productive. And one of the most productive efforts in terms of crime control occurred under the Clinton administration with the Omnibus Crime Control Bill, where they instituted the community-oriented policing program. I remember seeing the effects of that here in Columbus, Macon, and Albany, and Valdosta, where federal appropriations through the justice grants went to local police departments for them to engage the communities that they policed, to have community relations training, and for them to get to know each other a lot better. And I can remember here in Columbus where communities were having potluck suppers, where the residents were preparing meals in their communities for the police who were coming to help them root out drugs and vice in their communities. The communities and the police were working together. When the Clinton administration went out, the Bush administration came in, and they didn't have that as a priority. So the funding for the community-oriented policing program was diminished in that regard. And of course, it was not increased because of resistance from the Republican majority in the Congress under the Obama administration. But believe me, the community-oriented policing program worked, and it helped to reduce crime tremendously during that era. Not only that, we have justice grants. The most dangerous time for young people, we are told, is between 3 in the afternoon and 8 o'clock at night. Because in so many communities all across the country, youngsters are unsupervised. And so there are justice grants that were a part of that Omnibus Crime Control Bill, which were funded in order to construct that time. The Boys and the Girls Clubs, the Boy Scouts, the YMCAs, and for Family Connections organizations, and various other nonprofits that would have after-school programs and summer programs where they could do tutorials, and they could have computer services and homework and constructed activities during that time frame, which would construct that time for young people and keep them out of trouble. The funding for that diminished. We are fighting for that. I'm a member of the Congressional Black Caucus as well as the Democratic Caucus, and one of the items that we submitted to President Trump in our meeting with him, and that was our executive committee 2 months ago, we submitted a 125-page document with footnotes suggesting to him how he really should make America great. Specific recommendations of legislation that had been introduced by members of the Congressional Black Caucus and various other members of Congress that would actually get to the root of the problems of crime, rather than trying to attack it just on the surface with incarceration. And of course, we don't know if he's read it or not, but we know that it was delivered to him along with being delivered to the media. So he can't say that he didn't know.
Okay, this is a state-related issue, but see, we have Representative Hughley and Senator Harbison. This question is, when will Georgia join other states which do not tax military retirement? Can you give Senator Harbison the microphone, please?
Senator Harbison? Let me, before he answers that, let me just say that During my 16 years in the Georgia General Assembly, every year that was a bill that I offered and tried to get passed. And I even fought to get a seat on the Ways and Means Committee, which handles the tax legislation. And the first year that I got up there, Marcus Collins, the late Marcus Collins, was the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. And I offered the bill to exempt all military retired pay from Georgia income tax. I said, you know, South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, and Florida have all done that. We need to do it. Nothing happened on the bill. The first month of the session went by. Mr. Chairman, when are you going to call my bill up? It's not ready yet. Not ready yet. Get down to the last week of the session. Mr. Chairman, where's my? He said, come in the office. He said, we can't do that. But we're going to try to offer an exemption for all retired pay when we do the code revision and the tax revision. And we can't do that because if we take away money from the state treasury, we won't have money to appropriate for all of the things that you folks want to spend money for. And Georgia has to have a balanced budget. We can't spend any more than we expect to collect in revenue, and that's why we have the highest bond rating of any state in the country. And so you need to understand that. I had to say, yes, sir. But he did offer a partial exemption of all retired pay in the next session of the legislature, which passed, which was, I think, $3,000 or $4,000.
It's more than
but it wasn't full exemption like some other states. Senator Harper.
Thank you, my congressman, and I approve that message. You are absolutely correct, and for those of you who do not know, my understanding is almost every year now from the House side. Prior to that, as Congressman Bishop did when he was a member of the Senate, that bill would get introduced every year. I introduced it in the Senate, but eventually we came to the conclusion that it had to come from the House side, and thereby Representative Smith introduces it, and I support it in the Senate. But my understanding is that before, there was actually a law in place whereby military veterans received that exemption. However, they were sued by the civilian aspect of federal employees, and they won. So in response to that, Georgia backed off from the law altogether, because right now I think it would cost something in the effect of like $100 million in order to fund it. So there's been some suggestions right now to reintroduce it incrementally until we can afford to pay for it over the years. And I believe that's where we are right now. But right now, we try it every year. As a matter of fact, it is part of the Chamber and City of Columbus's agenda for us to introduce that legislation. Thank you, Congressman. I got drafted. I get paid for this.
Okay, the next question is, how serious is the domestic terrorist threat in your district and the military?
Well, as I told you earlier, that I was on the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. I guess it's been 10 years ago now, 10 or 12 years. During my time on that committee, one of the things that we were investigating was the presence of domestic terrorists in this country. And to my chagrin, we found out that at that time, 10 years ago, that there were at least 3 militia organizations located in southwest Georgia. They were training, they had guns and the like, but they were under surveillance by our law enforcement agencies. There is an organization that tracks the terror organizations out of Montgomery. I have not heard that much recently There is an active clavering of the Ku Klux Klan in the 2nd Congressional District. I have not heard of any instances of violence there, but they do have meetings, and they show their faces from, show their hoods from there. But domestic terrorism is a realistic concern. There are some bad actors. What we have learned is that there are a number of people that have been proselytized via the internet from the radical terrorists from the Middle East. Now, because our borders have been tightened, it's a little more difficult for them to get in, but the internet can get in. And so there are a lot of youngsters who are born in the United States, who have grown up in the United States, who are not immigrants, but who have studied some of their Mideastern history, and they have been attracted by some of these internet entreaties. That is a serious problem, and one that our intelligence agencies and our local law enforcement agencies, our federal law enforcement agencies, the Homeland Security Department, are trying to get a handle on how can we control and neutralize the internet invitations and outreach that is reaching and proselytizing some of the youngsters, causing them to become radical terrorists in this country. Many of them are homegrown. They are not people that came from outside. So that is a challenge that we face, and it is one that we have to be vigilant in dealing with.
Next question. What is your position on H.R. 756, the Postal Service Reform Act of 2017, and H.R. 760, the Postal Service Financial Improvement Act of 2017?
Okay, I can't remember those bills by numbers, but I have, for the last 5 or 6 Congresses, supported the legislation that would put the Postal Service on sound financial footing, that would give it the full rights so that they can continue to deliver mail 6 days a week. There have been efforts by the Postal Service to curtail weekend mail delivery, which is very much unacceptable by most members of Congress, and we've voted it down in the Appropriations Committee. We actually passed amendments on the appropriations bills that will say none of the funds included in this bill can be used to do X, Y, and Z. And although the Postal Service is independent, we have made it pretty strong that we intend for them to have 6-day delivery. And there's a division, though, between the majority and many of us in the minority as to whether or not we want to allow the Postal Service to get on that sound footing. The thing that got them under was a requirement that they pay their retirement in advance, unlike any other federal agency has to do. When they were forced to do that, it put them in the red substantially, and they have not been able to recover from that. But there are other private entities that deliver mail and deliver parcels that would like very much for the Postal Service to give them more opportunity to market. So it's a tug of war. We have people, veterans, for example, in rural communities that depend on the mail to get their medications. Elderly people who can't travel a lot depend on the mail for other essential items. So we want to make sure that we maintain a strong Postal Service and that it remains affordable, and that we can say that rain, shine, sleet, or snow, that the mail will be delivered.
Okay, next question. Would you be willing to come to Macon for a town hall meeting with Austin Scott or without, if he doesn't come?
I'm always willing to attend and to have and to host a town meeting anywhere in our state. I'm not sure whether it would be a good idea to have it with Austin Scott. Austin represents about 15% of Bibb County. I represent 85% of Bibb County. I represent about 85% of Muskogee County. I represent 100% of Dougherty County, the 3 metropolitan areas. Most of the 8th Congressional District is a lot more conservative than the 2nd Congressional District. So I would suspect that the interest and the issues and the discussion for people in the 2nd Congressional District in Bibb County would not necessarily be the same as the 8th District in Bibb County. Which means that Austin Scott probably would not want to have a joint town meeting unless it was limited to subjects on which we work together in common, which is agriculture and our national defense. We work together across party lines on the issues that affect our local communities, and of course on those issues I'm sure that we'll be in agreement, because we're fighting for our farmers and for our agriculture, and we're fighting for our military and our veterans, and we're lockstep on that.
Next question. What is your position on climate change?
Well, I believe in science. I am not one of those people that will put my head in the sand and ignore science. And the scientists tell us that we are experiencing climate change as a result of activities of mankind on the face of the earth. I believe them.
This is a similar question, but it deals with some of the other agencies in the federal government. It says, how do we deal with the attack on merits of science in the administration? EPA, Paris Climate Agreement, what will you do?
Well, one, let your voices be heard. Having represented agriculture and rural communities my entire time in Congress, I've come to understand that there's varying opinions about the environment and about what we can safely do to protect and to conserve our environment. So I try to look at every piece of legislation and every regulation in terms of 3 criteria, particularly regulations. Is it based in sound science? Is it subjected to a cost-benefit analysis? And does it make common sense? A lot of the environmental rules push the pendulum too far to the left. Some of the laissez-faire activities are too far to the right. I believe that we ought to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the people through the regulatory process. But those regulations, I believe, should be subjected to those 3 tests. Is it sound science? Subject the regulation to a cost-benefit analysis so there's a balance there. Does it make common sense? That's how I choose, that's how I decide. There are some environmental things like the Waters of the United States regulation that EPA was trying to enforce that wreaked havoc on a lot of farms because certain people in the Environmental Protection Agency were deciding that a puddle that was a result of rain farmland should be treated like a navigable stream under the Clean Water Act, which didn't make common sense, and it was not upheld by science, but because it was wet, they wanted to go on the farm and regulate what kind of fertilizer they could use, what they had to do in terms of the nitrogen from the chicken waste at the poultry houses, and that got to be a problem. Georgia Pacific in Cedar Springs, which produces paper products, cardboard products, they had a boiler mac rule for what they could emit into the atmosphere and what they could allow to go into the river. Well, the regulation that they wanted to impose required a standard that technology was not even created at that point. And for them to implement that would have cost so much money that it would have required them to lay off a substantial part of their workforce, which would have done a great disservice to those families, and it would have hurt that industry. So that particular regulation was one that I thought needed to be tested and needed to be slowed down so that it could be phased in or determined whether or not it was in fact actually needed. But those are very difficult kinds of decisions that have to be made, and again, I have to make them based upon sound science, cost-benefit analysis, and common sense. Having due regard for the health, safety, and welfare of all of our people. I was a Boy Scout, and I was taught that we needed to make wise use of our natural resources, not just totally not allow any kind of development or any kinds of industrial use.
Our next question, is it true that you have received $48,000 plus from the NRA?
Probably. I can't say exactly how much. I haven't calculated it, but when I started to run for Congress in 1992, I was given a list of folks that I should go and talk with across the district. And of course, I have some friends here in Columbus and Synovus that owned a number of banks in the 2nd Congressional District. And so I went to call on the people in those banks because I didn't know a lot of people in Southwest Georgia. And I went down to Fort Valley and went in to see the president of the bank. And he entertained me. I gave him my resume, and he let me make my pitches for why I thought that he should support me and get his friends and neighbors to support me to be the congressman. And after I did all that, he said, "Oh, that sounds good," and I'm impressed. He said, "But I got a question for you." I said, "What is that?" He said, "How do you feel about the Second Amendment?" I said, "Well, I support the Constitution. The Second Amendment is a part of the Bill of Rights, and I think that we have the right to bear arms." And he says, "Well, are you a member of the NRA?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, let me tell you something. If you want to be the congressman from this district, you need to be a member of the NRA. Are you willing to join?" I said, "Yeah, for responsible gun ownership." He said, "Well," he pulled out his desk drawer, said, "Here's an application. Sign up, and I'll pay the fee." And I recognized then that that was important. When President Clinton had the Omnibus Crime Control Bill, he had included in it the assault weapons ban. Having agreed to support the NRA in that opposition, I was pretty much decided that I was going to vote against it. but I got a lot of calls. Every one of my former colleagues in the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus called me and said, "You got to vote with the president on this. We got to stop these guns." And I got a call from Dr. Joe Lowry from SCLC and Benjamin Hooks of the NAACP and Jesse Jackson, Operation Push. And that was a lot of pressure. So I had committed myself to support the NRA on that vote. This was in 1994, I believe it was. And I was just totally undecided as I went to the floor of the House. And I walked across the street from my office to the Capitol, and there were all of the NRA people on the wall. And I said, well, I need to at least let them know that I'm not as certain as I had indicated to them. And so I stopped and said, look, I think I may not be voting the way that I told you I was going to vote. I walk into the chamber, I'm still just totally undecided and confused and just not knowing what I was going to do. And by this time, the vote had counted down from 15 minutes down to 0. Everybody had voted except me and 3 other people. And everybody knew that what my position had been, and they gathered around me. I got my card out and put it in the slot to vote. And everybody was around me. And boy, you talking about pressure. And I finally cast the vote, and it passed by 1 vote. And I voted with the president, with the restriction on the assault weapons ban. 3 months later, I get to Macon. I'm having a fundraiser for re-election. I drive up to the place where the fundraiser is, and there's a picket line across in front of the door where I'm going to go in. We want our guns. Vote for our guns. Shame on you. Shame on you. So I tried to charm the protesters and get them to come inside. They didn't. But the day after that vote, by the way, the morning after the vote, I ended up on CBS Morning News opposite Tanya Mataska, who was the lobbyist for the NRA. She was spitting nails, and I was having to explain why I changed my mind and voted to limit the guns. That was a very strong lesson for me, because when I got back home, I had a lot of grief from my constituents in Southwest Georgia. So I had to really come to grips with how do I deal with these tough issues. And I thought about health care. I thought about education. I thought about helping young people, helping people in rural communities, and all of the good that I wanted to do as a member of Congress. And I said, you know, the first law of politics is to get elected. And if I'm not elected, I won't be able to do any of these good things that I want to do for the people of the 2nd Congressional District, because the NRA is a one-issue organization. So I decided that I was going to try to neutralize that, and I would support them to the extent of supporting the Second Amendment. And so I'm very careful as I look at the legislation. Much of the legislation that has been pro-gun control legislation has been broad enough, so broad that it would include law-abiding citizens, for example, veterans, who for one reason or another are not capable of managing their own affairs, maybe because they are disabled physically, not necessarily mentally, and they can't get, so they have a representative appointed to handle their VA benefits. Well, part of the gun control was to, if they were declared to have a representative to handle their affairs, that they could not have a gun. That, I thought, was a disservice to a veteran. And I could not support that. I believe that guns should only be in the hands of people who are mentally responsible and who have no criminal record or anything that would indicate that they are not capable of exercising the gun ownership in a responsible manner. I believe that there should be due process. If you tell somebody they can't have a gun, they ought to be able to demonstrate that they should have a right, and then let that be decided. But they should have due process. It shouldn't be summarily done. So that's a tightrope that I have to walk as a representative of the 2nd Congressional District, where the values of God, country, work, family.
Okay, next one was a statement and a question, I guess. I've been very upset with your voting record concerning wildlife and animal protection in general. 2 years ago, you had the lowest score of any Democrat in Congress on the Humane Scorecard, and last year was very little better. I would like to hear your rationale for your shameful scores, since all of your Democratic colleagues scored considerably higher than you did.
Let me just say that I don't base my votes on party policy. I base my votes on the people of the 2nd Congressional District. I have a lot of people in the 2nd Congressional District who live in rural communities, who are animal lovers, who utilize animals in various aspects, and with regard to that, I support them. I have a lot of, as I said earlier, poultry is #1 in the country, in the state of Georgia. And there are some issues with the Humane Society, some of the animal rights groups, as to what the humane treatment of animals in slaughter facilities are. And there are some people who are here to the left who feel that if you have a chicken house, the chicken has to have a certain amount of space in order to lay the eggs. I mean, there are a number of policy positions on that people feel very strongly about. And I remember A.J. McClung used to say, well, some of my friends are for it, some of my friends are against it, and I'm for my friends. I can't always be that way. When I weigh the number of jobs that are in my district with poultry, with beef, and other animals that are slaughtered for food, I have to try to weigh and balance. And I have to support agriculture because that's what makes Georgia's economy work.
Both pro-agriculture and humane, you say that. Those are not mutually exclusive.
It's not always mutually exclusive. That was one issue, for example, the slaughter of horses, which some of my agriculture colleagues have been in favor of, which I oppose, which is on the side of the animal rights.
Okay. How is the president's stance on immigration affecting our farm industry?
Our farmers?
Yeah, farming industry.
Our agriculture industry and our production agriculture people are very, very concerned because the growing of crops, particularly produce in southwest Georgia, is hard work. It's out in the sun, and there are very few native-born Americans that are really willing to do that kind of work. And as agriculture is such a large industry in our area, our producers have to have people who can work on the farm. And they do that through the guest worker program, which is the H-2A program. And they have a great deal of difficulty with the red tape trying to get that done and to get it done correctly with the government. And sometimes when they make the application and they have orchards on the trees, watermelons in the fields, and the government red tape takes so long, they're spoiling and rotting in the fields, and they can't get the workers to handle it. And so it creates a problem for them. And of course, we've been trying to reform the H-2A program for a number of years, and we just haven't been able to get that done because of people who think that it's not humanitarian enough. So we're still working at that. But that is a fear of many of our agricultural producers. If they get all of those hundreds of thousands of dollars of crops in the ground, and when harvest time comes, they have the INSP program, and they run off their workers, and they lose hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars worth of crops. That happened in the state of Alabama, and it almost happened in Georgia when the Georgia legislature was about to pass a bill. Fortunately, the Commission of Agriculture interceded and pointed out that Georgia could follow in the footsteps of what happened when Alabama's legislature did that, and Georgia's legislature backed off. But it's very important that we have workers who work in the agricultural industry. Otherwise, it could be a calamity. And so they are very, very concerned about the president's immigration stance. They want a comprehensive immigration bill, and they want assurances that they will be able to get the necessary workers that they need to harvest and to work their crops. And that is one of the goals that we hope that we can get accomplished this session, because it's vitally important.
Okay, next question. Last year, Vice President Biden launched a moonshot initiative to cure cancer. But under Trump's proposed budget, funding to the NIH, EPA, CDC, and other agencies whose work relates to cancer research, and in parentheses, a lot of folks don't know that the EPA does cancer research. How will we continue Vice President Biden's cancer moonshot under such a stupid, moronic budget? And the last statement is, this should not be partisan.
Unfortunately, it's not partisan. As I told you about the FY17 budget that we passed last week, we fully funded the NIH and gave it a plus up. And for FY18, the Trump proposed budget, you can rest assured that NIH and our health research and cancer research will continue, because cancer is not partisan. We're caught up in the health care, and the President has issued some directives that certain research is not to be shared, and they aren't supposed to notify, make public statements without approval of what research they're engaged in. But I'm here to tell you that Congress is not going to step back when it comes to research to deal with the health issues that we are faced with. When I was on the Defense Subcommittee of Appropriations, I was amazed when I first got on that committee to see how much money we spend in the defense budget to deal with cancer research. I can tell you that prostate cancer, breast cancer, the sickle cell, bone marrow transplants. All of that research was advanced to the point where we're almost able to eliminate sickle cell. Yeah, this is better. We're almost able to eliminate those because of the research that has been advanced. The Moonshot Initiative, Vice President Biden was embraced on a bipartisan basis, and I believe very strongly that it will continue. I'm a cancer survivor, and there are a number of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle who've been faced with that, who have had family members who have been faced with it. It's not a matter that's taken lightly, and I don't care what the president might recommend about cutting off that research, it's not going to happen.
Okay, our next question will come from Facebook. It specifically is for Albany, Georgia, but I think it has a nexus to what we're talking about here tonight. It comes from Mr. Travis Parker. He says, why are so many businesses leaving Albany, Georgia? And will minimum wage ever go up from $7.25 per hour?
I expect that the minimum wage will go up. You may recall that there has been an ongoing debate within the Congress and within the states as to when, whether, and to what extent the minimum wage should be raised. It was an issue in the presidential race. It's an issue in congressional races. And I can tell you that I have been 100% supportive of every increase for the minimum wage. There are a number of industries, particularly the fast food industry, that really fights raising the minimum wage. But people must have a living wage in order to survive as the cost of living increases. The cost of, well, not the cost, but the increase in income over the last 2 decades has been very uneven. Our middle class is not the middle class that existed in 20 years ago, 15 years ago, is no longer as well off as it once was. Our, I guess, income levels for the wealthy have increased astronomically as compared to middle-income people. And it is recognized clearly that in order for people to be able to afford health care, in order for them to be able to afford decent housing, for them to be able to even pay back their college student loans, they have to have a living wage. And of course, to have the minimum wage be stagnant as it has been when the cost of everything else has gone up is really just not acceptable. So I support the increase in the minimum wage. Why businesses leave Albany or any other place is always a matter of dollars and cents. If the business is profitable and the people who have supplied the capital for that business are getting a return on their investment that they feel is sufficient, then they will stay. If they don't feel that they are getting the return on their investment, they will likely move someplace else or shut the business down. It has been my desire and my hope for the time that I've been in public office that I would do everything in the offices that I held to create an atmosphere that would be conducive to the growth and the development of businesses and jobs. And of course, I do everything that I can to try to create through the policies that we implement are policies that will create an environment that will enhance economic development, enhance jobs, and will increase businesses. In some of our areas, we've been able to do that. We look at TSIS, for example, here in Columbus. That down the area, the campus where TSIS is located was in an area where the combined sewer overflow, the old sewer system in Columbus, Georgia, was deteriorated. No more development could take place down there. But when I went to Congress and the Columbus Waterworks came and asked for an appropriation in order to create a new sewer system down there, we worked on it, and we were able to get appropriations to help the city, along with other local funding, to do the combined sewer overflow, which resulted in their deciding that we'll put a river walk on top of it. We'll be able to comply with the Clean Water Act with our discharge with the sewer system, but at the same time we'll put a nice face on it and have the river walk. But of course, by improving that sewer system, it opened up the downtown area for development. And so Columbus State was able to move down there. TSIS decided to locate their facilities down there, and that's like 7,000 jobs that are in the area. And so, you know, that's just one instance of how a policy and an appropriation can create jobs, and those are good paying jobs down at TSIS too. And they pay more than minimum wage. But again, the point I'm trying to make is that I try to do the things and create an environment through the policies that will help the communities to thrive and to help families to have a better quality of life.
Okay, our next question comes from Twitter, from War Eagle Mom and Nancy B. Wash. She asked the following question: do you support a special prosecutor to investigate Russia's involvement in our 2016 election, and if the Trump campaign was involved?
Yes. And I might recommend for your reading a book called The Plot to Hack America. It's written by Malcolm Nance, who is frequently interviewed on CNN and MSNBC. He's a former intelligence agent, and he has done a lot of research and documented a lot of relationships with Mr. Trump's associates and campaign supporters. And just based on this, as well as all of the information that is coming out as the onion unpeels in the various hearings in Washington, it's clear to me that we need to have an independent commission to investigate it. Whether or not that should be a special prosecutor at this point is probably premature. The facts need to be investigated and need to come out in a bipartisan, or should I say a nonpartisan way, because the hacking, as it relates to the elections in 2016, indicate that our democracy is under attack. And if you read this book, you will understand clearly the arguments that are very convincing that Mr. Putin is intentionally trying to destroy all of the democratic institutions and to undermine them for their more authoritarian, in favor of the more authoritarian form of government. and the history of hacking in elections in Europe. And this is the first time we've known about that in the United States. And just the information that came out about the election in France just this weekend should give us all pause. So, Malcolm Nance, the plot to hack America, I think it would be very thought-provoking for you.
So, follow-up, why is it taking so long?
Well, when you have people that are having allegiance to the president, who were elected under the banner of the president, they're very reluctant to attack and to show that person in a bad light, or to show the administration in a bad light. And so since they're in the majority, and they can control the rules, and they can control whether there is an investigation or not, and what direction that investigation is to take, they exercise that, I guess, for self-preservation, which is unfortunate. I believe that this rises to a level that goes far beyond partisan politics. This goes to the very heart and soul of our country as a democracy. To have the attacks on on the First Amendment, the press, and the disdain that is being out there makes it very difficult for the people to understand and to know what truth is and what the facts are, because everything now is, you know, not factual according to certain folks. And if the population does not know what is truth or what the source of truth is, it's very difficult to make informed decisions in selecting the people who make the policies, who decide who gets what went out. So, you know, we've got a problem. And I think that as the onion continues to unpeel, as we peel it back one layer at a time, there will be a public outcry, and there will be an uprising, and there will be resistance sufficient to require and demand a thorough, bipartisan investigation. I'm not sure how long that will take, but I surmise that it may not take too much longer.
The movement to decriminalize and legalize marijuana and medical cannabis has greatly increased within the last decade, with legalization in California, D.C., Colorado, and Washington. Would you support legalization of medical and recreational marijuana if it came up for a vote? And what is your opinion of Attorney General Jeff Sessions' prohibitive attitude against marijuana legalization at the state level?
Okay, the answer is yes. I commend the senator from Macon, Adam Peake, for his diligence and his determination to have medical marijuana legalized. As I indicated earlier, I'm a cancer survivor, and during the course of my treatment, I met a number of people who were also suffering with cancer, and some of them, the only relief they could find when they were going through that chemo to keep their appetites was marijuana in various forms. Some of them got it legally, some of them got it illegally, but because of the need, they actually secured it and got it. And I was surprised to talk with one of my constituents who was a law enforcement personnel who had a family member who had cancer and was suffering greatly. And this law enforcement personnel did not want to procure the marijuana for his relative, but he encouraged other family members to do so. And he confided to me that he did that knowing that it was against the law, but that his love for his loved one was sufficient that he was willing to encourage his relatives to do that. I think that we've come to a point in time where we should do what is possible to relieve the suffering of those people who need the medical cannabis. And I am certainly on the side of those folks who want to make that happen as soon as possible.
And what about the VA? What about the VA?
I have supported and voted in favor of having the VA to do that. Of course, the Attorney General has indicated that he's not going to have any parts of that. But I think at some point he won't be there, and I think
Okay, tort reform and buying health insurance across state lines are two means of reducing health costs. Will you support these two efforts in the House, regardless of the position of the Democratic leadership in the House?
I have no problem with the sale of insurance across state lines. It has to be worked out with the respective insurance commissions, because each state has the authority to regulate insurance within its boundaries. Congress can pass a law under the Commerce Clause that would supersede that, and I would be supportive of that. I think that the sale of insurance across state lines would contribute greatly, I think, to the competitive nature of insurance and allow prices to be go down because of the competition. As far as, I'm sorry?
Standards, too.
Yes, of course. Got to have standards, and of course, if Congress passed a law, that would be standards, and that would have to be regulation.
It would reduce the availability and the protections that we have from our state insurance bonds.
If, like I said, that it's not easy, but those things would have to be worked out. There would have to be some kind of standards. There would have to be some regulatory authority that would provide for protections for individuals regardless of where they are in the country. And I think that that could happen if there's a will for it to happen.
On a federal level, you think that there would be the standards for it, or is it
I believe that on the federal level there could be the standards for it.
It would be nice to have one set of rules instead
Yes,
of
exactly, exactly. And if under the Commerce Clause, Congress got into that business, which it has not, and it has resisted it up to this point, there would be standard laws across, and that's the argument that's made in a lot of areas now. We don't need to have 50 different sets of regulatory authorities. We need to have one set of rules nationwide, and that's made in a lot of areas. With regard to tort reform is in the eye of the beholder. I believe that every American ought to have the right to have their issues redressed in a court of law. And of course, I believe that the jury should be able to decide the rights and the liabilities of the respective parties. That may be because I'm a trial lawyer by training. I started out doing legal aid, recognizing that there was always a disparity between the litigants. Some people were well-financed and had a lot more clout before the law than others. But I recognize that under our form of government, we have a right to jury trial, and I hate to see that eroded. I think that there should be some standards. I believe that there are forms of tort reform that could perhaps make our system better. Some limitations on what kinds of causes of action can be broken, what can be brought. That could be standards that were put in place, for example, with medical malpractice, that if those standards are met, then there's a prima facie case that there's no negligence. But again, it's very difficult because you have the far left and the far right on that issue. I believe that everybody should be able to have their day in court.
Could anything ever be possibly done to change the statute of limitations, especially when it was a child?
The statute of limitations on various causes of action have been put in place in the law for years in order to be able to cut off a time when somebody can come back and bring an action, so that the law would say that enough time has elapsed that if you have not complained at this point, that you should be barred from complaining in the future. What that statute of limitations should be for various causes of action is always subject to the legislature or to the Congress, depending upon whether it's a federal cause of action or a state cause of action. Sometimes when there's a late discovery under many state laws, the statute of limitations runs only after the discovery of the injury or the wrongdoing has been made, and that's when it starts to run. In some other cases, in some other states, and under some other laws, it's when the cause of action actually happened, when the wrong was done, not when it was discovered. That is the area where there's debate within legislative bodies between states, and why lawyers sometimes, if they can file a case in a state that has a longer statute of limitations, they will, because those laws are there.
Okay, next question. How can you help maintain internet neutrality from those who incentivize net providers from slowing band speed for rival websites?
Net neutrality was put in place by the FCC last year over the objections of a lot of big internet players. I happen to have an office that is populated by millennials. And they are very much internet savvy, and they have made me know that the internet is one of the most democratic forms of expression. That anybody, if they can get on the internet, can get access to information, and that it ought to stay that way. Unfortunately, those with money and power and influence have been able to influence the majority to overrule the net neutrality law that the FCC put in place. So Congress voted not long ago to override that regulation. And I think the President Trump has signed that legislation. So again, it comes to a matter of arithmetic. We are going to have a majority of members of Congress who are willing to protect internet access for people who are not as wealthy, people who can't afford to pay those extreme prices to get preferential treatment. And that again is the time for people to offer resistance and to get engaged and to let your elected officials know how you feel about net neutrality. And if enough people speak up and are heard on that issue, it'll change.
Is there any plan to do an investigation into the FCC hacking that occurred over the weekend in regards to the hacking of the FCC website in relation to Title II comments? It was clearly hacked to prevent people from being able to voice their opinions to the FCC about withdrawing the Title II provision for the net neutrality rule.
I can't say that there is an organized effort between the weekend and now, but I assure you that that is an issue that people are very much aware of and that Congress will in one way or another respond to. When and how that will happen, I can't say, but there are enough people who feel strongly about it that something will happen. But we got to keep the heat on.
What is your opinion about Representative Conyers' Medicare for All bill?
We
Is that something
can't
you
hear you. Ken, we can't hear you either. Your battery dead.
have it on? Sorry. What is your opinion about Representative Conyers' Medicare for All bill? Is that something you would support? And if not, why?
I would support it. If you go back to the origins of the Affordable Care Act, the single payer was the first desired option, but the people on the other side of the aisle did not feel that that was capitalist enough. And so they wanted to have the private sector involved and reduce the government involvement. And of course, Medicare for All would be having the government to do it. So in order to get the Affordable Care Act, compromises were made on how we would get it funded. And the complicated morass of rules and regulations that came to be to almost 2,000 pages of the Affordable Care Act was enacted as a compromise. It would have been a lot simpler if we just had Medicare for all.
Yes. Cheaper too.
Next question. I'm very concerned about funding for the state health insurance program, SCHIP, which funds Georgia Cares. In the FY18 budget, will this program be protected?
That's a $64,000 question. Those of us who support the Affordable Care Act, those of us who believe that health care should be available for all, that it is really a human right, would certainly be fighting. But it will be a fight because SCHIP and children's health is under attack. The bill that was passed last week would result in 78,000 children in Georgia possibly losing their health care. That's SCHIP. So I want you to know that I will be fighting to make sure that no child has to live without health care.
What's your stand on not allowing VA to get rid of CRDP? CRDP.
What is that?
Mr. McBride.
Combat-related,
Huh?
combat-related disability pension.
Are you talking about the concurrent receipt?
Yes.
Okay. That's the issue where if a veteran is disabled and retired from the military, he can't draw both his retirement pay and his VA disability unless it's 100%. And that has been a problem for a number of years. We have been working consistently to try to get what we call concurrent receipt, where the veteran can receive both, regardless of whether or not he's 100% disabled. First, even if it was 100% disabled, he couldn't get them both. But Congress was willing to give the 100% disability with full retirement pay, but not unless it was 100%. Then it was moved down a little bit more. Now the desire is if the soldier or the military, not soldier, but the military personnel is disabled 40%, that person should be able to draw the full retirement and the disability pay. That is the proposal that's in Congress now. I have been, for the full time I've been in Congress, in favor of, and I co-sponsor every year, of the bill for full concurrent receipt so that a disabled veteran can draw both his retirement and his disability pay. He should not be penalized and have to choose one or the other. I haven't chosen for him.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, 7:32, so this is going to have to be the last question, and we'll give the congressman a chance to give us some closing comments. This is about H.R. 305. It's the one requiring all presidents to release their tax returns. It says it's not, the H.R. 305 is not co-sponsored by you to release taxes. What bill have you co-sponsored to do this?
I don't know the bill numbers, but I know that I have co-sponsored a number of, there have been several that have been introduced, particularly over the last 2 months, to require the release of tax returns, and I fully support that, and I signed on to them. I have to look them up and tell you.
Will you sponsor 305? Because 139 of the other Democratic representatives have.
Okay, who's the primary sponsor?
I think it's SU. I think it's SU.
Anna issue? Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. I support it fully. Yeah. Just remind me to tell SU to put me on the bill when I get back next week. Well, let me just thank everybody for coming. I must say that I was very pleasantly surprised when I arrived and I was greeted with a dozen people with signs of thank you. Unlike the arrival I made in Macon a few years ago with those signs about the guns. But thank you so very much. I appreciate your engagement. I appreciate your interest. And I want to give a special shout out to Indivisible Columbus. I think it's very, very important that those of us who are elected stay close to the people who elect us. I can't be your advocate if I don't know what you want. I can't articulate your aims, your needs, your concerns if I'm so isolated that I can't communicate and you can't communicate to me. So what I have always tried to do as your representative is to be accessible. I give out my cell phone number. I go to public restaurants. I have people that buttonhole me at Walmart, or the grocery stores, at the service station, on the church grounds, to tell me what their concerns are, or to ask me if I can provide some assistance. That is what I view as my job. I ask you to give me that public trust and responsibility to work for and in your behalf. But you help me to do that when you let me know what's on your mind. I say it all the time. It's the squeaking wheel that gets the grease, and it's the crying baby that gets the milk. So I want to hear from you, but more than that, when I hear from you, we want to do our best to respond. I want to thank my staff who's here, and I said earlier that the staff really are extensions of me. When I'm in Washington, they're the ones that answer the phone. I have people in the offices in Columbus, Albany, and Macon who are there just to be there when you need something from us. I have field representatives that travel across the 29 counties every day. They attend meetings, city council meetings, school board meetings, county commission meetings, family connection meetings, any meeting that there is, they want to be there to find out what's going on, what people need, and they relay that information to me every week in their activity reports so that I can keep in touch with what your needs and your concerns are. And I appreciate your sharing that with them, and I appreciate you sharing it with me. I have people that call me. I had 2 or 3 calls while I was waiting to start this meeting with questions and needs and requests. But that is the nature of this job. Believe it or not, it's 24/7, 365 days a year. And my wife is back there, and so I want to just give a shout out to her for tolerating that. She doesn't understand why I don't turn my phone off. But we sometimes get calls at 2 in the morning with some catastrophic situations that are life and death situations, and if we are able, we want to step in and help. Again, thank you all for coming. Feel free to call on us. We're there to make our office be a help office. So anything that you need, you think we can be of help, feel free to call on us.